The Passion of Jesus the Christ, which has been preserved by the Church and handed down to us through the centuries for our hearing, our understanding, and our discussion this morning. One of the 12, the one named Judas Iscariot, went to the couple of high priests and said, "What will you give me if I hand Jesus over to you?" They set it on 30 silver pieces. He began looking for just the right moment to hand him over. On the first of the days of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Where do you want us to prepare your Passover meal?" He said, "Enter the city, go up to certain men and say, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I and my disciples plan to celebrate the Passover meal at your house.'" The disciples followed Jesus' instructions to the letter and prepared the Passover meal. After sunset, he and the 12 were sitting around the table. During the meal, he said, "I have something hard but important to say to you. One of you is going to hand me over to the conspirators." They were stunned. They began to ask one after another, "It isn't me, is it, teacher?" Jesus answered, "The one who hands me over is someone I eat with daily, one who passes me food at the table. In one sense, the Son of Man is entering into a way of treachery well marked by the Scriptures. No surprises here. In another sense, that man who turns him in turns traitor to the Son of Man. Better never to have been born than do this." Then Judas, already turned traitor, said, "It isn't me, is it, Rabbi?" Jesus said, "Don't play games with me, Judas." During the meal, Jesus took and blessed the bread, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. "Take, eat. This is my body." Taking the cup and thanking God, he gave to them. "Drink this, all of you. This is my blood, God's new covenant poured out for many people for the forgiveness of sins. I'll not be drinking wine from this cup again until that new day when I'll drink with you in the beloved community of God." They sang a hymn and went directly to Mount Olives. Then Jesus told them, "Before the night's over, you're going to fall to pieces because of what happens to me. There is a scripture that says, 'I'll strike the shepherd, helter-skelter, the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I, your shepherd, will go ahead of you, leading the way to Galilee.'" Peter broke in, "Even if everyone else falls to pieces on account of you, I won't." "Don't be so sure," Jesus said. "This very night, before the rooster crows up the dawn, you will deny me 3 times. Peter protested, "Even if I had to die with you, I would never deny you." All the others said the same thing. Then Jesus went with them to a garden called Gethsemane and told his disciples, "Stay here while I go over there and pray." Taking along Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he plunged into an agonizing sorrow. Then he said, "This sorrow is crushing my life out. Stay here and keep vigil with me." Going a little ahead, he fell on his face praying, "My Father, if there's any way, get me out of this. But please, not what I want. What do you want?" He then left him a second time. Again he prayed, "My Father, if there is no other way than this, drinking this cup to the dregs, I'm ready. Do it your way." When he came back, he again found them sound asleep. They simply couldn't keep their eyes open. This time he let them sleep on, and went back a third time to pray, going over the same ground one last time. When he came back the next time, he said, "Are you going to sleep on and make a night of it? My time is up. The Son of Man is about to be handed over to the hands of sinners. Get up. Let's get going. My betrayer is here." The words were barely out of his mouth when Judas, the one from the 12, showed up, and with him a gang from the high priest and religious leaders brandishing swords and clubs. The betrayer had worked out a sign with them. "The one I kissed, that's the one. Seize him." He went straight to Jesus, greeted him. "How are you, Rabbi?" and kissed him. Jesus said, "Friend, why the charade?" Then they came on him, grabbed him, and roughed him up. One of those with Jesus pulled his sword, and taking a swing at the chief priest's servant, cut off his ear. Jesus said, "Put your sword back where it belongs. All who use swords are destroyed by swords. Don't you realize that I'm able right now to call to my Father and 12 companies, more, if I want them, of fighting angels will be here, battle ready? But if I did that, how would the scriptures come true that say this is the way it has to be? Then Jesus addressed the mob. What is this? Coming out after me with swords and clubs, as if I were a dangerous criminal. Day after day I've been sitting in the temple teaching, and you never so much as lifted a hand against me. You've done it this way to confirm and fulfill the prophetic writings. Then all the disciples cut and ran. The gang that had seized Jesus led him before Caiaphas, the chief priest, where the religion scholars and leaders had assembled. Peter followed at a safe distance until they got to the chief priest's courtyard. Then he slipped in and mingled with the servants, watching to see how things would turn out. The high priest, conspiring with the Jewish council, tried to cook up charges against Jesus in order to sentence him to death. But even though many stepped up, making up one false accusation after another, nothing was believable. Finally, 2 men came forward with this. He said, I can tear down this temple of God and after 3 days rebuild it. The chief priest stood up and said, what do you have to say to that accusation? Jesus kept silent. Then the chief priest said, I command you by the authority of the living God to say if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus was curt. You yourself said it, and that's not all. Soon you'll see it for yourself. The Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Mighty One, arriving on the clouds of heaven. At that, the chief priest lost his temper, ripping his robes, yelling, he blasphemed. Why do we need witnesses to accuse him? You all heard him blaspheme. Are you going to stand for such blasphemy? They all said, death. That seals his death sentence. Then they were spitting in his face and banging him around. They jeered as they slapped him. Prophesy, Messiah, who hit you that time? All this time, Peter was sitting out in the courtyard. One servant girl came up to him and said, you were with Jesus the Galilean. In front of everybody there, he denied it. I don't know what you're talking about. As he moved over toward the gate, someone else said to the people there, this man was with Jesus the Nazarene. Again he denied it, salting his denial with an oath. I swear, I never laid eyes on the man. Shortly after that, some bystanders approached Peter. You've got to be one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then he got really nervous and swore, I don't know the man. Just then a rooster crowed. Peter remembered what Jesus had cried, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. He went out and cried and cried and cried. In the first light of dawn, all the high priests and religious leaders met and put the finishing touches on their plot to kill Jesus. Then they tied him up and paraded him to Pilate, the governor. Judas, the one who betrayed him, realized that Jesus was doomed. Overcome with remorse, he gave back the 30 silver coins to the high priest, saying, I've sinned. I betrayed an innocent man. They said, what do we care? That's your problem. Judas threw the silver coins into the temple and left. Then he went out and hung himself. The high priest picked up the silver pieces, but then didn't know what to do with them. It wouldn't be right to give this a payment for murder as an offering to the temple. They decided to get rid of it by buying the potter's field and use it as a burial place for the homeless. That's how the field got called Murder Meadow, a name that has stuck to this day. Then Jeremiah's words became history. They took the 30 silver pieces, the price of the one priced by some sons of Israel, and they purchased the potter's field, and so they unwittingly followed the divine instructions to the letter. Jesus was placed before the governor, who questioned him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus said, if you say so. But when the accusations rained down hot and heavy from the high priests and religious leaders, he said nothing. Pilate asked him, do you hear that long list of accusations? Aren't you going to say something? Jesus kept silence, not a word from his mouth. The governor was impressed, really impressed. It was an old custom during the feast for the governor to pardon a single prisoner named by the crowd. At the time, they had the infamous Jesus Barabbas in prison. With the crowd before him, Pilate said, "Which prisoner do you want me to pardon, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus the so-called Christ?" He knew it was through sheer spite that they had turned Jesus over to him. While court was still in session, Pilate's wife sent him a message. "Don't get mixed up in judging this noble man. I've just been through a long and troubled night because of a dream about him." Meanwhile, the high priest and religious leaders had talked the crowd into asking for the pardon of Barabbas and the execution of Jesus. The governor asked, "Which of the two do you want me to pardon?" They said, "Barabbas." "Then what do I do with Jesus, the so-called Christ?" They all shouted, "Nail him to the cross." He objected, "But for what crime?" But they yelled all the louder, "Nail him to a cross." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere and that a riot was imminent, he took a basin of water and washed his hands in full sight of the crowd, saying, "I'm washing my hands of responsibility for this man's death. From now on, it's in your hands, your judge and jury." The crowd answered, "We'll take the blame, we and our children after us." Then he pardoned Barabbas, but he had Jesus whipped and then handed over for crucifixion. The soldiers assigned to the governor took Jesus to the governor's palace and got the entire brigade together for some fun. They stripped him and dressed him in a red toga. They plaited a crown from branches of a thorn bush and set it on his head. They put a stick in his right hand for a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mocking reverence. "Bravo, King of the Jews," they said. "Bravo." Then they spit on him and hit him on the head with a stick. When they had had their fun, they took off the toga and put his own clothes back on him. Then they proceeded out to the crucifixion. Along the way, they came on a man from Cyrene named Simon and made him carry Jesus' cross. Arriving at Golgotha, the place they call Skull Hill, they offered him a mild painkiller, a mixture of wine and myrrh, but when he tasted it, he wouldn't drink it. After they had finished nailing him to the cross and were waiting for him to die, they whiled away the time by throwing dice for his clothes. Above his head, they had posted the criminal charge against him. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Along with him, they also crucified two criminals, one to his right, the other to his left. People passing along the road jeered, shaking their heads and mocked lament. "You bragged that you could tear down the temple and then rebuild it in 3 days. So, show us your stuff. Save yourself. If you're really God's son, come down from that cross." The high priests, along with the religion scholars and leaders, were right there mixing it up with the rest of them, having a great time poking fun at him. "He saved others, he can't save himself. King of Israel, is he? Then let him get down from that cross. We'll all become believers then. He was so sure of God. Well, let God rescue this son now, if God wants him. He did claim to be God's son, didn't he?" Even the two criminals crucified next to him joined the mockery. From noon to 3, the whole earth was dark. Around mid-afternoon, Jesus groaned out of the depths, crying loudly, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Some bystanders who heard him said, "He's calling for Elijah." One of them ran and got a sponge soaked in sour wine and lifted it on a stick so he could drink. The others joked, "Don't be in such a hurry. Let's see if Elijah comes and saves him." But Jesus, again crying out loudly, breathed his last. At that moment, the temple curtain was ripped in two, top to bottom. There was an earthquake, and rocks were split in pieces. What's more, tombs were opened up, and many bodies of believers asleep in their graves were raised. After Jesus' resurrection, they left the tombs, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. The captain of the guard and those with him, when they saw the earthquake and everything else that was happening, were scared to death. They said, "This has to be the Son of God." There were also quite a few women watching from a distance, women who had followed Jesus from Galilee in order to serve him. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the Zebedee brothers. Late in the afternoon, a wealthy man from Arimathea, a disciple of Jesus, arrived. His name was Joseph. He went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate granted his request. Joseph took the body and wrapped it in clean linens, put it in his own tomb, a new tomb only recently cut into the rock, and rolled a large stone across the entrance. Then he went off, but Mary Magdalene and the other Mary stayed, sitting in plain view of the tomb. After sundown, the high priests and Pharisees arranged a meeting with Pilate. They said, "Sir, we just remembered that liar announced while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will be raised.' We've got to get that tomb sealed until the 3rd day. There's a good chance his disciples will come and steal the corpse and then go around saying, 'He's risen from the dead.' Then we'll be worse off than before, the final deceit surpassing the first." Pilate told them, "You will have a guard. Go ahead and secure it the best you can." So they went out and secured the tomb, sealing the stone and posting guards. Well, after all that long reading, and lots of readings today, Palm Sunday, that's par for the course. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what it all means, because I think that there's so many places one can go, but there's also so many places that one could spend a lot of time. So I want to do this morning what I've done in other Palm Sunday services, and I just wanted to ask you, now that you've heard the story again, and each year we hear it from a different gospel writer, this time from Matthew, were there some things that jumped out at you that you hadn't remembered from the story before? It's a long, long story. Is there anything that you heard this time that you hadn't remembered from before, or something that was particularly poignant to you based upon what's happened to you this year, what's happened to you this week, what's happened to you in the world, that makes it seem like, oh yes, I don't think I've heard that before yet?
I think that area at the beginning where it has the coat and so forth, the image of Jesus riding in on 2 animals seems to be a strange.
Yeah, but it's true that that's what he did. He did ride in on 2 of them, and yeah, according to Matthew. And so the only way that one can do that is side saddle. You can't straddle both this way. So he was sitting on one with his legs over the other. That's how it's traditionally shown in the scripture coming into Jerusalem. I don't know if that has any particular meaning, but I think that was the way that one greeted the crowds. It was a traditional way. Yeah.
What struck me is sort of a dissonance on some thinking, and maybe is Judas goes and kisses Jesus to show the crowd that, you know, this is Jesus, but here he is in the temple and in the past, and he's preaching. So how did they not, this band of conspirators, how did they not know it was Jesus anyway?
Well, this is one of the ironies of the whole thing. The religious leaders didn't spend a lot of time in the temple.
Okay.
So they may not have known him, or know who he was, or might have looked different. And it was also night.
Okay.
But I think the implication there is that for religious leaders, they weren't too religious.
I was surprised by Pilate's wife telling about a dream, and I want to know more. Like, I want to know what the dream was. You know, what happened in the dream.
She had a dream, apparently, that said, you know, be wary of this man, so wash your hands of the whole thing.
Right.
Oftentimes in depictions of this in the movies and The Last Temptation of Christ and things like that, it's a little bit more prolonged. She comes to him and she has this terrible dream about what's going to happen, and she tells Pilate to, to stay out of it. The truth be known, even though Pilate is presented here as somewhat of a fair judge, he was a ruthless man. Ruthless. Everybody was definitely afraid of him. And even though he has this idea, here of I think in The Last Temptation of Christ, it was played by David Bowie, if I remember correctly. And, you know, sort of a mild manner, okay, well, this is what you want to do, this is what's going to happen. But Pilate was not like that at all. He would have sold his own mother and put her up on the cross with Jesus if he'd had the chance or the inclination. And I think that one of the reasons that his wife comes to him is because she sees great trouble in this. And actually what happens...
Including a resurrection, do you think?
I think she sees that, but what happens after this, Pilate stays on for a little bit longer, but he meets a very untimely end himself. I mean, he's removed, and he's greatly disgraced by them. This is how ruthless he was. The Romans thought he was so ruthless, they removed him. Because he was too awful that they didn't want someone like that even ruling. John.
On the last page, where it mentions that the tombs were opened up and many bodies of believers were raised, and then they entered the city and it appeared to many. I had forgotten about that. Is that sort of a metaphor or symbolic, or what was that?
Well, one would have to ask that about the whole story. The whole story could be somewhat metaphorical. Could be metaphorical. Could be somewhat historical. It's, you know, anything is possible. But the tradition of the time was, because of the earthquake and because of the greatness of the event, that it broke open the tombs, and there were many who were resurrected with him. It was just not Jesus' resurrection, but many others also. So this is where a lot of the denominations who are different in their belief system than ours say that the second coming happened then. Jesus came when he was born, then the second coming was then. And that now we're in the end time, and have been all this time.
It's stricken when I was saying about the Romans judging Pilate. What struck me was the criminals who were crucified alongside Jesus were mocking and making fun of him. But I don't find that surprising, because I think sinners do that. They like to judge other people and not look at themselves.
Yes, we do.
So I think, right?
Yeah, and in the other gospel account of it, one of the criminals actually is nice and says, "Well, I believe you are who you say you are." Every gospel account has a different writer has a different account.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. The version I'm saying is where he forgives this other criminal.
He does forgive the other one.
Says you'll be joining me in heaven.
Right, and he has. I think he even has a name in the other one, or one that's attributed to him. Dismas.
At the risk of being asked to leave, this passion usually really moves me. That there's this line here where Jesus says, "You said it. You yourself said that I am the Son of God, and that's not all soon to see it for yourself. The Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Mighty One, arriving on the clouds of heaven." And it just says to me, this is delusional, and these people are in a state of mass hysteria.
Well, that is a point of view. And I think that there'd be a lot of people who, looking at the whole story, would say that's true, and looking at the whole gospel would say that's true. A lot of it is quite delusional. As you know, I've been teaching the book of Revelation at Fordham this semester, and every time the more I teach it, the further we get into it, I see the students just shaking their heads saying, "He's lost it now." Just, you know, it's really, this can't even be real. This doesn't even sound real. And the thing about the story is that there's parts you can take from it that seem very real. And how does one discern what was real and what isn't? But even if you didn't do that, does it make the story any less important in its import?
Not in terms of history.
Not in terms of history, perhaps, yeah.
Another difference that I see in Matthew compared to some of the other Gospels, and I like it because it's a wonderful sign of forgiveness, is that although the servant to Caiaphas had his ear cut off, missing from here is where Jesus took it and reattached it.
Yeah, that's in the Gospel of Luke, because Luke has this whole healing thing going on. So Matthew was thinking he had his ear cut off, good, let his ear be off. You know, and Luke says, no, we got to put it back on. That's a kinder Jesus even at the end. I think that the one thing that struck me this time, and of course I've heard this story and preached on it many, many times, and one of things I was saying to Anthony about writing my Easter letter to you this time, and maybe you sensed it perhaps in my writing, was that when you said what you had to say about the story, and you said it the first time, and supposedly or hopefully it was your best work, to try to say it another, well, now it's been 27 years for me, to say it another 26 times, to say, what new can you bring out of this story? What possibly could be relevant and astounding? But I did think of something that I thought I had not heard before, or maybe because it's who we are as a congregation at the moment, or who many of us are, and that it seemed to me that there was a lot of lifting up in this story, but more than anything, I saw a lot of laying down. The people laid down the palm branches for him to come into the city. He lays down his life for what he believes. There's a lot, if you look at the words all the way through, there's a lot of laying down, coming down. The word down, or the whole idea coming down to the ground, everything that appears a lot of times, and I hadn't noticed that before. So metaphorically speaking, or actually speaking, I'm thinking, okay, what can that mean? What does it mean when we have all this laying down of things in order for things to be accomplished? What would that say to you, if anything?
There's nowhere to go but up.
There's nowhere to go but up. That's not bad. You know, that'd be kind of a flippant remark for Easter, but yes, in some ways, I would say that's true. What else would you say?
We have to give of ourselves. That's what that is.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that one of the things that the gospel lesson is trying to say, metaphorically speaking, is that it is in the laying down of things, and it doesn't necessarily mean giving something up, just laying it down, just letting it go. It's in the letting go of things, the laying down of things, that what really needs to be accomplished happens. We spend a lot of time trying to lift everything up, not realizing that in the story, at least the gospel story, has already been done for us. That lifting up, God does the lifting up. What we need to do in response is to lay it down. We are so busy trying to lift it up and carry it that we never put it down enough so that we can be lifted up. And I think that's a really great message for the whole Holy Week experience. One of the things that we can do, and that we're invited to do during this Holy Week experience, and through this whole gospel lesson, and in everything that Mel and her choir and everyone else is bringing this morning, the music, is the whole idea of being joyful for the laying down of it, for letting it go, for not having to carry it. It's not necessary. So many of us carry the baggage and the other things that we don't need. And I've said this before, but never have I seen it so clearly as when somebody will go so far to prove it as to actually lay down one's life, his life, and say, okay, I'll go. What is it going to take? All right, I will give you the ultimate. If I laid down my life for you, would you still react and be the same person? And unfortunately, I think that most of us would still be the same person because we are not ready to have it laid down for us. We always, it's like a penny. We see it there, we just can't let it lay. We have to pick it up. Maybe that penny needs to be there. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't pick up loose change, because the church can always use whatever you'd like to contribute. There are pews, there are envelopes in the pews. You know, that's my cue. But the whole idea of just letting it be, laying it down, as the way to accomplish the purpose, the end. That is something that we don't do enough. I mean, we're encouraged to do that when we come up to communion. We're encouraged to lay it all down and saying, I'm going to leave it here. I would really like, if a preacher had his or her way, this is what they want. They want a lot of mess at the altar rail. Leave it here. Don't take it back with you. You're encouraged, you're invited, It's open, leave it here, but don't take it back with you. Jesus couldn't take it back with him. He was lifted up on the cross, which is just, it's not a very pretty picture of lifting up. But the reason he was lifted up and not just nailed down on a cross and laid on the ground, the whole idea was that, yes, Jesus is lifted up, but that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is that he lays it down and is taken down, and at the end of the story, he's finally laid down in the tomb. That's the end of the story. Those are the key words for me, that we need to lay it down in order for us to really finally, at Easter, be lifted up.